You got 21 on right now and some more 23, I think, coming on. So let's go. Let's just get rocking. You've had a long day and I want you to free you up. So we are going now, action. So we are starting tonight with our extremely special guest. It's weird calling you doctor, you know?
I know typically
Not that you don't deserve
in the UN system, it's only really the highest level people who use the phrase doctor, but yeah, you can indulge me tonight. That's fine, yeah.
Do you want me to indulge you? I will.
Sure.
Okay. I'm going to pull up your, just one sec here. There we go. Just one sec. I've got to get your bio open here. I was reading through your bio and I was really impressed. Oh, sorry, one sec. So give the folks background. Dr. David Ainsworth and I call you David. From going forward, you're going to be Dave. And I have been, how long have we known each other?
My gosh, I mean, we were working together really at Rio Plus 20. That was really when we started to do a lot. And then maybe about a year and a half before then.
Yeah. So that's been almost 10 years around there. Seems so long. It doesn't seem that long, to be honest.
No, it doesn't seem that long, but 10 years have gone by, sure.
But so David Ainsworth, just one sec. Here we go. So you've been with the in the UN system for 18 years.
Yeah.
And the majority of which has been at the UN Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, working in communication, marketing, policy development. And so the bulk of your policy work has been in the international sphere, and you came at it from, migrated from your academic work in political science at McGill, where you focused largely on rights and democracy. And I believe that you were largely focused on Latin America. Is that true?
Yeah, it's true. My doctoral work was really about state-society relations. I was doing work in Mexico about that time when everyone was interested in civil society and the thickening of civil society, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So what year was that when you were finishing your PhD in that era? Like what era was that?
So I finished my PhD sort of at I guess it was 2001, the beginning of the 21st century. And yeah, when I finished that, my focus then in terms of, sustainability was really about human rights, social capital and all of that. And so, some of those things that we talk about now in terms of associational life and what that means for policy outcomes, I was looking at it back then for participation basis.
Environmental justice and these kind of things. And so,
yeah, I mean, in Mexico, those are the kind of organization you looked at, people who were looking for environmental justice, whether it was, in cities like Guadalajara or it was in Oaxaca, where you're looking at how small communities were trying to fight for sustainability, for the right for sustainability.
So I don't know if I've told you about my times predating that in '96 when I was in El Salvador and Nicaragua with the FMLN and hanging out and getting a feel for that. So I know you perceive me as a right of center individual these days. But I actually was at one point in my life, I was quite far left. I had
if you're hanging out in El Salvador and Nicaragua in those times, you're definitely still left, right?
I had a Che Guevara t-shirt, I'll put it to you that way. Okay?
I'll have to see it sometime. I'll have to see it.
It's in the closet somewhere far away. But so what brought you into the environmental field aside from the academic work? Like, was it your interest in that research that really kind of brought you into those problems, or what was the draw?
Well, for me, it was both a draw to continue some of these ideas that were related to sustainability and human rights and justice. But then there was also a whole other sort of one of those circuitous accidents that happens when you're in Montreal, because I was, doing my PhD in Montreal at McGill University, and it was a small community. And in addition to the people I was working with who were doing work on human rights, I'd also run into this group of people who were, musicians and interested in technology. And they got involved in a private company that I got on board. And then also I met Marcos Silva, who was a person who was involved very much in information and data organization.
Right.
So I ended up actually taking a bit of a sidestep where I worked for a technology company in the last years of the 20th century. And that technology company was trying to work in the environmental space. They were working at information management,
Right.
for the Commission for Environmental Cooperation.
Uh-huh.
And that's where I started to bring in the whole environmental element, because this is going to be slightly embarrassing to your class here, but
Mhm.
prior to that, all my work in sustainable development had really been about human rights and economy and political economy. Really, the environmental component there is
Mhm.
something I really started to pick up in those first few years, to look at the importance of the biosphere and human relationship with their surrounding environment.
Mhm.
So.
So life charted its path for you.
It did. I mean, what it fed into is when I was younger, I went to Pearson College. I mean, those of you, if
That's right.
you're physically near Royal Roads University, you'll know about Pearson College. And so I went there in the 80s, and
Mhm.
that's how I finished my high school.
Mhm.
And there, I mean, that was really my eye-opening awakening that, right, we are a planet of different cultures, different languages, different approaches to problem solving.
Mhm.
So the way that I came about it was that the idea that, wow, these institutions that are multilateral, that take different cultures into account, are an important part of how we should be engaging, as
Mhm.
global community, local communities. And so that was kind of the big foundation
Mhm.
that I think I really credit for me helping to get a sense of understand what we need to do in these big multilateral agreements.
So I mean, your worldview then, as a global worldview, international worldview, was largely starting to be forged, at least to some part, perhaps even maybe it's fortified when you went to Pearson College, because your colleagues would have been from Singapore, like all over the place, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when I was, so here I was a teenager, 16 years of age. And so I had a British roommate, an Iranian roommate who was a refugee.
Mhm.
One other year I had a Mexican and a Filipino
Mhm.
guy who were the roommates. And so we had to learn all these different cultural differences and
Right.
understanding these different mixtures. And it was also the kind of audience where, sure, we were teenagers hanging out together, but we were a community of engaged people. So we would have these, weekly things we'd call village meetings,
Mhm.
but we talk about issues. I mean, we talk about the conflict going on between Israel and Palestine. That
Wow.
was a big deal,
Back
and
then.
teenagers
Yeah.
discussing it even back then.
Yeah.
And then also back then, Pearson College with its program that's the Race Rocks program that started out there became a really important place for people to become aware of what was already going on with the biosphere back then. So I'd had some of those ideas originally, but yeah, it was about the idea that solving these big challenges of sustainability
Mhm.
and working across communities, it was about cultural understanding and about the challenges of this kind of multilateral dialogue.
So, well, given that context and give that explanation of, the need for multilateral organizations, tell us what the UNCBD is. Like
Yeah.
what is it?
So, I mean, the UNCBD, it's the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. I mean, it is one of the most widely subscribed environmental agreements that the world has. Today, the only countries that aren't parties to it, that haven't signed on to it, is the Holy See, so the Vatican, and they even attend our meetings. I've had participation of them showing up in the meetings,
Mhm.
and the United States. And even the United States was involved in the early negotiations of the agreement. So everyone else is on board.
Right.
Um, so the Convention on Biodiversity, it's one of the other children of the Earth Summit, of the Rio meetings.
Mhm.
So we were born out of Rio. The Framework Convention on Climate Change was born there. The
Mhm.
Convention to Combat Desertification, and then the set of forest principles was also born there. So,
Mhm.
we were born at that time, that, time of the early 90s, when it was
Mhm.
obvious to the world that we needed these big legal instruments, these transnational instruments to move forward on. And so the convention, I mean, it's a compromise, because when it first came out, it was, in some cases, it was really started by the conservationists. So the people who did IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, as it's called now, it had a different name back then, were really about, right, we need an instrument that'll allow us to really set up protection
Mhm.
for species and ecosystems around the world. And that was the conservation urge.
Mhm.
Certain regions focused on it, but the deal was that if that was going to be one of the urges, we knew that we needed to conserve, the variety of life on Earth. Then the other part of the deal was, well, what about the countries that wish to develop?
Mhm.
What about their needs to reconcile a need to develop and feed growing populations, and to deal with a model that would allow them to create the wealth that would help them, deal with impoverishment.
Mhm.
And so the CBD was born. So you had this agreement that says, right, you need to conserve biodiversity. That's the first objectives. That's protected areas,
Mhm.
specific programs that are about conservation of ecosystem, species, and genetic. And then you need sustainable use.
Mhm.
How do you come up with the frameworks and agreements to ensure that the exploitation of this is done sustainably. And then the really radical part is the third pillar, which is that if you're going to conserve and you're going to sustainably use it, you need to make sure that the benefits are shared with equity. And that's the real thing that really made the agreement a full sustainable development tool.
But that didn't come about until COP11 when Nagoya, right? The Nagoya Protocol really articulated that, correct?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that was the one thing. So for years and years, and even today, people hear about the Convention of Biological Diversity and go like, oh yeah, you're the people about protected areas. You're the ones that built these national parks or enabled the building of these national parks everywhere. And it is only with the enactment of the special protocol on the access and the sharing of benefits from using genetic resources. It's only with that we've got a greater push on that area. And that idea that we've moved far on conservation, but not as much on sustainable use or an equitable benefit sharing, that kind of push and pull dynamic, it shapes the negotiations. I even saw it today. I mean, we're in the middle of negotiations now with governments. And I saw that the fact that one part is in a little bit retardé, it's a little bit behind everything else. So.
Right. Yeah, we'll get to that because that's one thing I wanted to get at as we go forward. So in terms of like, if we've read any of the global biodiversity outlooks or the IPBES reports, and most of the folks on this are familiar with those reports, or at least the names of them. And then some of the literature that's coming out, you know, the planetary boundaries work and so forth. We recognize that in fact, biodiversity and ecosystems are in pretty rough shape right now, especially even in respect to climate change. Like if you're to look at, I mean, if you're to follow the planetary boundaries model, you'd say, well, if just looking at that data, biodiversity and ecosystems are like red zone emergency sirens going off, and climate change is a big issue. But I mean, there's still, you know, it's not quite as an emergency as the experts say as biodiversity and ecosystems. So given that context of where we're at right now, what's the importance and what is the role of the CBD in addressing this pretty critical situation we're in?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of perspectives you can take it. You know, you can be a little bit more antagonistic and pessimistic, more optimistic. Because the pessimists would say, you know, you've had this agreement that's been in existence, entered into force in 1993. And look, you know, notwithstanding the work on protected areas, the work you've done for invasive alien species, all these different things here, we're still seeing massive biodiversity losses. The IPBES report concluded, you know, we've got the risk of a loss of 1 million species within, and we're just seeing all the indicators going down for ecosystem services. So one of the claims could be is like, you know, what good has this agreement done? We've created the framework for this global cooperation and national levels, and countries haven't achieved it. You know, what has it done? You know, this doesn't sound like a good proof of the value of international cooperation. Yeah. The other thing is that there is research that talks about, you know, in the absence of the CBD, where would we be at? And the thing is that, you know, research will tell you that notwithstanding the dangerous situation we're in now with degradation and overexploitation of resources, it would be worse if we didn't have some of the provisions for the Convention on Biological Diversity. I mean, the even just the simple notion of creating a network of protected areas around the planet has created some refuge in some places for resources, you know, even under the case of marine systems, where the level of protection is only today creeping back up. There's evidence that those kind of marine protected areas have a tremendous impact on fish stocks. Or the convention's provisions on trying to bring about sustainable fishing has had some successes in some other areas where you actually have that policy carrying about. So it's an example of where you have the global agreement, notwithstanding the fact that indicators are looking really, really bad. The global agreement has allowed things to slow down so they wouldn't be absolutely terrible.
Right.
And the agreement has actually created the conditions where we can imagine having the right jumping off points in the road to come.
Well, you bring up an interesting point, and it would have been nice. I mean, it would be interesting to have you and Katya, one of our former guests, go head to head on this issue, because she was talking in terms of the UNFCCC and the inefficacy of voluntary policy frameworks. So international frameworks such as the, which, although it's legally binding, one could almost say to some degree it's voluntary, right? There's no massive stick coming down you in terms of a fine or what have you, if you don't make your conservation targets, or in that case, emissions reductions targets. So she kind of poo-pooed the, not that, but highlighted the weakness of some of that. However, at the same time, you know, what you have brought up here, your point, and also in addition to your point, I would say, would be the convening power of the Secretariat, the convening power of bringing nation states together to discuss these issues. You know, there's that, which in itself has a lot of value as well. I would argue as well.
I mean, the whole question of the matter of, you know, legally binding, what does it mean? Because you're correct. So under all of these treaties, you know, the finding of a decision. So when the Conference of the Parties meets, like they do every 2 years, and they reach a decision with regard to an issue area. So the text and the language of that decision, it has effect in national laws, so that, you know, countries are, you know, mandated to ensure that their laws are in compliance with this. And in fact, actors in civil society, so whether it's local communities, whether it's indigenous peoples in local communities, any other stakeholders, they actually have the rights to refer to the convention text and to bring their governments to task for it. You know, I'm aware that in the case of Argentina, there were questions about developments in some wetlands and questions of hydro development. And there were local actors who used the text of the convention to bring the government to step forward and to carry out the proper kind of assessments and taking into account the needs of wetlands ecosystems for it. So it has that, but there is this question about, you know, do you have a legally binding framework? But as we know in international relations, whether you go into the peace and security front or other ones, or human rights, those, when you get to there, do those even have the legal? I mean, we've got the Security Council, we've got the International Criminal Court in that case. You know, do they move forward? The idea of having a voluntary commitment, it does feed into the development of a notion of a community of people who are willing to step forward.
Absolutely. And I think this is, I want to clarify Katya's argument, which she made a good argument, which in terms of enforceable greenhouse gas targets, ultimately in the day in terms of efficacy on something certainly as concrete as that, where you have, you know, say in Canada, emissions reductions targets per province or what have you. I mean, they're clearly, the process of regulating that will fall within the nation state or deferred to the province if that's the case. But that's not to say that the UNFCCC does not have a role in brokering what those targets are going to be and establishing a platform for that reference, either whether it be legally or procedurally for that matter, like establishing the scientific parameters for assessing how you go about measuring them, for instance, from a mitigation standpoint, or what does adaptation mean in that context. Similarly, in the biodiversity context, you could look at what does conservation mean? How do we actually go about assessing sustainable use and so forth?
Exactly. I mean, for example, if you look under the question of agriculture, so the provisions for agricultural biodiversity under the convention, they set a lot of the frameworks for what constitutes sustainable agriculture. You know, sustainable land use. You know, the management of land over the long period of time, and it sets a framework that can allow for capacity development for the countries that are saying, like, you know, if these are the sort of things we need to do, what do we need to achieve that? And so it gives you the framework to have technology transfer and that going from developed to developing countries in that case. It also sets a bit of a challenge and a baseline for people to move forward. Without these global agreements, you would have problems getting, you know, early adopters to move forward, and then have other people catch up to it as well. So it's important. It sets the global framework as well. I mean, the question of how you set a global set of ambitions and then you divide it up and chop it downwards. For us under the Biodiversity Convention, it is really the Gordian knot now, because as any of the people here who joined in the seminar know, is we set targets 10 years ago. So we had the Aichi biodiversity targets that were agreed in Nagoya, 20 different targets that covered, you know, different aspects of conservation, sustainable use, access and benefit sharing, etc. And you know, those targets were set at the global level, and then countries were invited to make sure they have their national targets. Well, one thing that we realized is that in some areas, those global goals were great markers or steering posts that guided countries, but in some cases they weren't. And so there was this mismatch between what we asserted the global goal and what national governments needed to. And so that articulation between the two levels is something that our new framework that we're going to be working on now has got to deal with. You know, how do you ensure that there's, you know, meaningful connection on all the different levels?
Very interesting. It's actually akin to the work that we've been doing with national governments in the Caribbean, developing their reporting platforms and so forth. And there's always this disconnect with the indicators that are put forth or suggested, whether it's be from the UNCBD or UNCCD. UNCCD is a little more didactic with their indicators. And then what is the data that's gathered on the ground, right? There's always this like big, huge disconnect. And in that case, you have a capacity development issue too. I've noticed here that Nina's on, Nina Lantinga from Lantinga Vita, the company that I previously mentioned. So that just cued me to think another really valuable asset of the UNCBD that, in fact, I think I was more involved in at the earlier stage with Dave Stuerman, is the attempt at aligning with the private sector and creating like, well, what does it mean to meaningfully address biodiversity within your business, right? Like, who do you look to in order to get guidelines or best practices or what have you? And one of the values that I saw right away, and in fact, one of the most interesting things I stumbled upon at my first COP back in 2011 was the Business and Biodiversity side event held at I think it was the group from Germany was the initial group. So there's that too, and we'll get to the private sector interaction in a bit. But one of the things you mentioned here is this idea of establishing goals, targets, indicators like the HE targets, and inherently in doing so, I mean, we're relying on some form of knowledge, data, indicators, or what have you, in order to make those goals, but also to report on them. So, I mean, that and this interface between science or knowledge acquisition and policy is, you know, it's an area of much study for a long time. And one of the things we've been looking at in this course is, well, what are the bodies of knowledge that can contribute to that process? So at the CBD, how do you navigate that? Like, I know you have folks that work exclusively on TEK, or at least with IPLCs and work in that area. What have you come up with, and how do you address that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple of parts there. There's the science policy interface that needs to be addressed. There's the question of, you know, systems of knowledge, traditional knowledge, and, you know, scientific knowledge. And then there's even just within the idea of scientific knowledge is the validation and selection of these processes. And all of the stuff is wrapped in, of course, the entire issue of politics.
Right.
You know, the CBD for years and years, I mean, it did have, you know, reference to important communities of knowledge. People represented with an IUCN, the IUBS people as well. So important communities of knowledge that would come up with establishing the basis for policy across the areas. But one of the challenges we had was that within our process, you know, we had our subsidiary body on science, technology, and technological assessment, our SUBSTAs, and that's where the knowledge was supposed to be adjudicated. But what was becoming pretty obvious soon on is that this subsidiary body that was supposed to be, you know, choosing the best science was getting caught up in political areas. So it was becoming essentially a prep con. So, you know, any political struggles that would have been played out at the other level were still being used in the scientific discussion. And so to that end, it was interesting to see governments come together and agree that they needed to create IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, you know, a way of paralleling what you had in the IPCC, minus all the politics that we already see in the IPCC as well.
So is that where IPBES? So I mean, I know why you'd get it. I know. I mean, it's understandable why one would say we need IPBES, but it was precipitated. The creation, for those that are who are not familiar with it, it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is basically a scientific body similar to the IPCC but focused on biodiversity. But so is it that precipitated? Was the politicization at the convention level?
I mean, you remember my perspective, you know, I'm a little bit chauvinistic. I talk about the convention. I think that was really a big part of it. I mean, so other bodies though realized, so FAO also realized they needed a body that would be able to investigate matters with politicization. UNEP themselves as well also knew that they wanted well. So it was, but a big part of it was to say, how do we come up with a body of knowledge or a place that will discuss and generate accepted sort of, you know, standards for knowledge.
Right.
You know, and I think part of that was because, you know, we saw the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment experience, which you know, we looked at, and that produced interesting results, but it was realized that was incredibly expensive, but needed to be institutionalized.
Correct.
So they put that together. So for us, and this isn't the only source for us, but it's become an important source of some of the main data. So the IPBES Global Assessment that came out a little while ago provided a lot of the background data for our own outlook. There's questions that we just ask them. Our Conference of the Parties says, right, we need this knowledge. Let's ask IPBES to put this report together. So that's it. So that's part of it. So that's part of the whole that whole idea of adjudicating the scientific. But the one thing that's good that IPBES is picking up on too is recognizing that, one mode of creation of knowledge that's associated with scientific academies or whatever, has also got to take into account traditional knowledge. And so IPBES has got this whole process now where they bring in the consideration of traditional knowledge as part of this as well. They've got some ways to go because they've started late. And so I think the way that they're fully articulating that and bringing that together needs a little bit more work. But
even back in with the MA, with the Millennium Assessment, they're onto that track as well. Like that was,
well, the convention, we recognized from an early date that traditional knowledge was important. There's Article 8J under the convention, which gives a very special place to traditional knowledge that's relevant for conservation and sustainable use. And it had already elevated to a certain platform. And in fact, to the point that members of Indigenous peoples and local communities within that particular working group that deals under that article, they've got a special forum where that they actually have speaking rights equivalent to parties in that particular forum. So there's that attempt of, but it's not easy. I mean, adjudicating these two systems of knowledge is not easy, without a doubt. We know that it's got to be moved forward. For example, if we even hope to come up with proper sustainable use guidelines, if we even hope that we're going to come up with a manageable protected area system, we're going to need to take into account these knowledge things. I mean, the other thing too, just, sort of coming back to the question of knowledge and indicators. I mean, one of the big subjects that's being discussed now at our substa and as part of the global framework is to come up with the right set of indicators and tools that we can use for it, and do it. And it's getting the right balance. Is that, so you want a series of indicators and a monitoring framework that's robust enough and captures all of the aspects of natural resource management, sustainable use, conservation, etc. So you want that, but you want it to be in a format where you've got the data, where national governments can use it or can build their capacity, and where it's straightforward enough that policymakers can use it. Because those of you who are in the seminar who are doing science policy interface, there's always the trick is that policymakers need a certain level of detail, but they need it to be sort of fairly straightforward. So that they can make decisions. You need to come up with a framework that can help filter out and come up with some definite pathways for policymakers to move forward.
This is an excellent segue into my next question, which is a running theme in any course that I teach, which is critical thinking.
Right.
So, I mean, you've been in this game for a while, and you have seen, you and I have talked offline about stuff where there's some groups or individuals that may not have been employing the best critical thinking. We're not naming any names, but how important is that? And I think, my argument would be, even if you're dealing with local knowledge or traditional knowledge or science, you need to substantiate. There needs to be some kind of body of thinking behind that to I don't know, I wouldn't say legitimize is not the right word, but to make sure that is speaking to the right objective that you're trying to achieve. Right? Is that a fair way to say it?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is by the time that a lot of the decisions of the matters come up to the conference of the parties and they're being discussed in there, the decisions and the policy intentions they're layered beneath so many different interests, stakeholders mixed up in as well. So if you want to get the question of is where has the critical thought gone in to really come up with proper policy decisions? And it is an important question, where are these places where people are beginning to reconsider and contextualize what's gone wrong and what can be new ways of working. And the directions that we see now is, for example, subnational governments, cities, local governments are an interesting place where I think we see critical thinking.
Right.
Where does it come from? One of the theories could be is that these are layers that are really vulnerable. There's really no money in there. People have to be creative. On one hand, but also because it's such a local level, this participatory nature allows for a really, really undiluted contact between stakeholders. And so it allows you to really get at some of the issues. So, that's one area where I think we see a lot of critical thinking. Traditional knowledge, IPLCs as well, we're actually, seeing a recognition that ways of managing, ways of being within your ecosystem, managing needs, managing aspirations for a community can be rethought of in these other ways and knocked up against these other visions we have of growth. So,
one of the things that we've been using within with one of the courses, 586, is something called the LEO network. Are you familiar with that? The Local Environmental Observer Network, developed out of Anchorage, Alaska. And so that is quite an interesting, I don't know if Mike's on here, Mike Brubaker, he may be, I'm not sure, but he's one of the managers of that. And what's interesting about that is it's really democratizing, or at least opening up that whole area of sharing knowledge. The peer review process still is intact in it. So you have observations that are documented, say, for instance, I don't know, a rare sighting of coyotes, or the water level is quite low or quite high or what have you. But you still have built into that process of, here's the observation, I'm putting this up, and you have a secondary kind of a peer review process called a consult, to kind of give some insight as to what's causing that or what could be causing that. And what I find quite interesting about that is that's bringing that environmental observation and data acquisition to the grassroots level, right?
It's super important because it's an opportunity to do, capacity development. So you actually teach citizens that they've got an important observational role in this entire management. So there's a sense of belonging, a sense of ownership that's going on in there as well, a sense of teaching people what science is all about, what observation is all about, and it's a connection also with overall ecosystems. So it's really, really fabulous. And we know that even if we're moving towards the land of where we need big data to gather all of these things, that big data is not just gathered from from satellite data and stuff. I mean, I've seen a presentation by a member of the Chinese Academy of Sciences talking about the big satellite, but there's other more granular data that can be gathered by citizens. And for me, and this is probably my bias, because again, I came at all of this in terms of engagement and participation as well, as those citizen science projects really put people have skin in the game, because they're the ones who have they've seen the changes in flowering plants, they've seen the changes in pollinators over time. In this case, they've seen the changes in caribou. They're able to observe it and match these things and see what's going on, and then have some sort of a connection to it as well. Because in the work I do in communication, a big part of it too is about, right, not everybody loves nature, biodiversity, but if you give people the chance to engage and count in it, you can actually build some of that a little bit so people get away from. But it's hugely important. And what's really encouraging about these kind of citizen science networks is that you're able to build this observational basis, but then, like you said, the whole peer review process, people get to debate and understand, so they know what science is about. Because the other challenge we all know we've got right now is we're in an anti-questioning, anti-science age, where there's a number of people who understand that science and observation has a degree of uncertainty, and other people who are frightened of it. And so how do we combat that? And this is part of a bigger cultural project.
Good point. So we've already alluded to this before, which is where things are at right now. So we are basically at the last part of the road, or even past the last signpost in that highway that's marking the end of the HE targets, and rehashing and trying to map out what the next kind of set of objectives, targets, and so forth are going to be. So what's your opinion of how, like, the HE targets? Did we succeed, or I don't know if you can even comment on that, but how did it go?
So when we published Global Biodiversity Look 5 in the fall, which was the report card, right? It's like, okay, we tell the grades are in, we know we had the report card on what it was. And so we put out the report. And so the headline, I don't know if this is going to be reversed in the camera, but the headline that came out on here was like, world, failing biodiversity UN targets. So it was a failure, right? This is the front page of the Globe and Mail, front page of the New York Times. We missed it. So, because if you look at it, you say, right, for all those 20 HE targets, how did we do? And the truth is that for the majority of the aspects of them, we didn't hit it. We hit a certain percent of terrestrial areas, which was great. We managed to do some great controlling of pathways of invasive alien species. The Nagoya Protocol came into force. We got some things. Forestry cover improved, but we didn't hit it overall. So there's the glass is half full perspective, or the glass is half empty perspective as well. And so the glass is half empty is like, man, the world blew it. The glass is half full perspective is that when we look at, it's pretty clear why we blew it, where we did blow it. It's the idea is we set a framework up. There was this set of global indicators, but the linkage, as I said, with national things, there wasn't enough care taken to figure out how you did that. And then the other thing was pretty obvious is the whole framework of indicators. It took 4 years to put that together. So we created targets 2010, but it wasn't until 2014, 2015 when we even had the framework together to figure out how we were going to move forward on that.
And even at that, with the latest framework that I saw for the indicators when we first started on this in 2017 with St. Lucia, there was still a lot of debate as to what indicators were relevant for what. I mean, I remember looking at them going, well, why is this not nailed down? Because we're gathering data here.
Yeah, exactly. And I've been in the negotiations and watched these online, because we're doing the negotiations online.
Right.
I've watched the contact group where they're talking about indicators and targets.
Yeah.
And these are the questions. So the questions they are is like, right, we need to come up with an entire framework that's ready now. And even if we come up with a mechanism of experts to review and fine tune it, there's a real push to get that done tightly. So people say, if we do this, we've got 2 years to maximize to have it nailed down, so that the experts have got to do it. And then moreover, it's that we also need to make sure that these indicators are robust enough, scalable enough, connecting to national areas too. So that's an important part of it. Now, the other part that's important, I think, in terms of what we've learned too, is that the Aichi targets focused so much on governments. I mean, this maybe we can talk a little bit about other stakeholders like the private sector, is that it really took us until middle way through that last 10-year period to figure out, right, if we don't engage with the business sector, if we don't engage with the construction sector, the forestry sector, like all these other sectors that are actually, they're productive and they're having the impact, how are we going to make a difference?
Yep.
And so it's clear now that the next framework is going to have mainstreaming of these concerns into these main sectors as a big part of it. And the business engagement, I've got to say, and this might be just because I think it's doing very well, and this might be just because I've had some great successes over the last few weeks we've seen here now, but we're seeing a tremendous response by businesses, some very big businesses stepping forward and saying like, right, we understand that our businesses rely on biodiversity. And it's not just in terms of we need to have, social responsibility things to make us look good to our consumers. We understand that fundamentally dealing with biodiversity is a business case, that we will fail as businesses in the long run if we don't deal with it. And so we're getting big things. There's, the Business for Nature Coalition. We've got about businesses representing $4 trillion worth of activity stepping forward.
Wow.
Yeah, we've got more stepping forward the whole time. So that's an important part. And then the other important part, this isn't business, but it's the finance sector, is we've now got the mobilization of public banks and private banks and insurers to look into their entire analysis model to say, right, just like for the climate field, we're looking at, climate related risks.
Yep.
What about biodiversity related risks? Can we affect decisions that way? So this new framework is looking in that direction. So we know we made the mistakes, but we know so at least in the design anyway, those are being taken into account.
So kind of the equivalent of decarbonizing portfolios is being considered by some of the main financial organizations.
Exactly. Yeah. So no, but there's a lot more work to do because, the question of decarbonizing portfolios versus making, nature related, disclosures, or nature related risks as a form of disclosure has got more work to do. But there's a task force on that's going to be launching later on this summer. That's going to be dealing with some of these questions as well. So.
Well, it's inspiring to hear that work is afoot. And not only is it, it's been discussed obviously for the last 10 years off and on, or in different kind of pockets, but to see it have it so prominently ingrained into the work plan for development of this post 2020 framework, I'm really curious to see how this all maps out and how it all
is. I mean, the thing is, we're in a bit of a, we're in a really vulnerable time now because the framework is being negotiated. There's a text there. We're coming up with the associated indicators. It's still got to be negotiated. And we're doing this, at a time when, we're doing this by pandemic wise. These negotiations are virtual, so we're actually having negotiations via Zoom. Where typically this is a community that needs to get together physically to make it happen. And so we're trying to put this together. It's also happening at a time of an economic slowdown, which is a big deal. It's happening at a time when the pandemic is putting greater pressures for more development on a lot of countries to deal with the loss of income.
Yes.
And the other thing too, is that this is also happening at a time when we've got new emerging technologies that have the potential to really have an impact on biodiversity. And so in this case, we're talking about synthetic biology, which is some of these, genetic modification techniques like CRISPR technologies. And we're also talking about something called digital sequence information, which is, the digitization of life itself, and the idea that the information associated with life itself, can be owned without any kind of recourse to where it came from and those things. And those are other side issues that we're looking at as well.
So on the issue then of the relationship, because this is one of the other questions we started to get at it with the role of the private sector and civil society. When we start to, inevitably, we always look to, even in the sustainable development school or discipline area, technology can get us out of it, right? Technology can decarbonize our world and so forth. Yet, when we start to look at issues such as this, I mean, there are a whole lot of different risks and considerations that need to go into the application of CRISPR technology and DSI and other things. Well, how do we manage that process? Like I mean, I'll give you an example. The first and only protest I've ever seen at a COP conference, well, a CBD conference, was the Substar SBI that I went to in Montreal. We had those folks outside, with the signs about, protesting I think it was I forget what the nature of it was related to digital sequence information, CRISPR technology, and so forth. So how do we deal with this?
Well, it's a little bit tricky because I'd say under the convention process is we do have provisions to say that, right? So the forms of technologies that play with genetic resources. So in this case, living modified organisms. Most people talk about them as GMOs, but under the process, we like to talk about as living modified organisms because there's certain technologies that are considered to be even more risky. And that's what synthetic biology is about, is are we using technologies that can transform life, but use them in ways that are supposed to solve problems? I mean, one of the classic issues of and intractable ones for synthetic biology is the question of how do you deal with malaria? So we know that one of the possible solutions to eliminate malaria, something that, has got enormous health consequences, causes death around the world, it's an expensive disease. One of the ways you can deal with that is you can genetically modify mosquitoes in a way so that you could cause the populations of malaria carrying mosquitoes to die out. You can use that with genetic technologies. It's possible. And some people are saying this is what we should be doing.
Yeah.
The question is, though, is that, given that you're changing a species in an entire food web, an entire network of other, do we know what the impacts are?
Exactly.
Can we know what the impacts are?
Yep.
It comes down to people's faith in risk assessment. So that's, that's one part of it, is can we solve these problems with these technologies, but what are potential risks? That's one part of it. The second part about digital sequence information, it cuts to the heart of equity, because with the Nagoya Protocol, we finally had a tool where it was like, right, so if someone wants to go to, say, as the classic idea is Namibia, you go there, you want to get the Hoodia plant. And the Hoodia plant is something that's got an agreement that you can use for sport drinks, for others. You can produce a lot of the products with it. But for you to get that ingredient from the Hoodia plant, you've got to make a deal with the local communities on the use of it and the knowledge. With digital sequence information, you could come up with the information that represents the entire genetic sequencing of that thing, and you don't have a Hoodia plant. You just have it. And so therefore, you don't need to pay royalties to anybody. You don't need to pay for the access to associated traditional knowledge. You just use knowledge that you've got, this digital sequence information. And that information might exist because there was a specimen in a museum and you've got it that way. So that's a way where, you could argue it's like, we don't have to exploit these plants anymore. But then on the other hand, you're saying, well, if we don't have to exploit the Hoodia, what's the incentive to save these sort of things in the first place? And the other question is equity, because suddenly, again, people who've got the money to do digital sequence information do it. The convention's got tools to deal with these. The Cartagena Protocol can deal with synthetic biology and its risk assessment mechanisms. The Nagoya Protocol has got provisions for mutually agreed terms, prior informed consent for all of these things as well. So what we're coming down to now is that these technologies, can the mechanisms we have to manage them, can they be crafted to deal with them? Because with the question of synthetic biology and these technologies, we know they're going so fast. I've got a colleague of mine who's at the University of Ottawa, and he kind of makes fun of me sometimes. He says, listen, he said, it's so cute, you people at the Convention of Biodiversity coming up with your panels and risk assessment, all these protocols you're going. He says, private industry's gone beyond. He said, people are doing this in their garages and they're doing startups, and they're 5 years ahead of you. He said, they're 5 years ahead of you yesterday. They're 7 years ahead of you today.
So governance has to catch up.
It does. Can you come up with mechanisms that are fast enough? And that, I think that's a question that I think all multilateral institutions have got to come up with, is can we come up with governance mechanisms that span global, regional, national issues that are quick to respond?
Right.
It's hard because we know the process of achieving consensus takes a long time. I mean, maybe I'm a little bit old fashioned. I just remember to all my discourse ethic, all my Habermas, and how long it takes to achieve consensus in that.
One of my favorite philosophers, Habermas. Well, and it's an inefficient process. It is by definition almost. It takes time.
But it is slow. But then I guess one of the questions has to be then is, is society in all of its different parts willing to look at how to sort of I don't want to take back control. I'm going to sound like some of those NGOs that you saw during the protests here, but is society ready to deal with the pace or create a pace so that its institutions and developments are matching? Because one of the questions that we have now is, and this has to do with questions of transformational change, we are seeing such tremendous transformations in information technology, modes of production, exchange of information, to the point where we're dragged along behind it, right? We find ourselves, we've lost agency. So how do we take that back? We are the ones who run these institutions.
Correct.
So can we create or configure the institutions so that it makes sense? Why do we have this whole rhythm of this kind of speed, this kind of pace?
And also, it's just to switch gears in a way to look at this from a climate change standpoint. Climate change adaptation requires that we be more adaptive and nimble and respond to some of the changes that we're seeing, like simply from an industrial standpoint. How do we deal with some of the changes that were unforeseen? This came up last week in our conversation. So this, you made a reference to a phrase that has gotten quite a bit of airtime, at least from what I've seen over the last few years, and this is transformational change.
Yeah.
And inherent in transformational change is the notion of design, of addressing or responding to some of the needs that we're seeing from a governance standpoint, from an ecological standpoint, from a sociocultural standpoint, as well as recognizing the rate at which technology is evolving. So what is transformational change? I mean, we've heard bantered about quite a bit. And how do you see transformational change? And how is that, what role is that what's the necessity for that, at least at the convention level? And you can expand the society as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think you sort of put your finger on it. I mean, the notion of transformational change is that we can take control again of what's going on, so that the systemic changes, whether it's adaptation to climate change, whether it's reversing land degradation, how can we do this in a way so we take charge of these processes so it's not out of control? And that's what I think it is. Transformational change is one where you've got a degree of agency. You are able to steer the processes of change or promote some parts of it that give you the outcomes that you're seeking. So that you can do it. Now, I mean, the thing is that the specifics of it are really going to depend on which area you're in. Otherwise, it becomes a bit of a slogan. It's just, yes, we need transformational change. What does that mean? I guess it comes down to what is the intent? What's the direction? What are some of the endpoint goals? I mean, for us under the convention processes, I think all the transformational changes is guided by this we've got a notion of a vision for the middle of the century. And, the vision we've got, and this is, I think, true in the climate process as well, is that by the middle of the century, we've got to be in a state where for the biosphere, we're not losing the diversity of life anymore. So we're actually, we're in balance, we're in harmony with nature. That's a phrase we lose. But we've also, up to that point in time, we've restored some. So we've taken parts that have already been degraded and we've transformed it into some form of productivity. So whether it's agricultural productivity or whether it's restoring other ecosystems, rewilding, all these sorts of things as well. So our transformative change has got to lead us to that part. So, you count back and going like, so then what are the negative drivers of change that are preventing us from achieving this outcome? And then what are the positive drivers we need to sort of bring things back up to the proper state? And so transformational change has got to look at that. And so one of the things we do, if your class gets, if the people listening or go back into Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, but also into the global assessment, there are these transitions that are talked about. It's about 8 different transitions. And what they are is they're mixtures of policies, they're mixtures of behavioral change in a lot of different areas. And the points the ways what kinds of transformations are needed. So it's things like what we need for climate transformation that's friendly for biodiversity. What kind of an urban transition do we need? What kind of food systems transformation do we need? What do we need to do for forests and land systems? What do we need for freshwater systems? What do we need for health? What's the specific health transition we need that's going to look at human health, animal health, and overall ecosystem health? And so these transitions tied up with this end goal point us to where they need to happen. But I think there's room for that story to be written. And I'm kind of glad that's the case, because I think it would be a little bit suspicious if we're able to just look at these transitions and say, right, here's the recipe. There's still a lot written there in terms of what are the ways of configuring, individual change, organizational change, institutional collaboration to make that happen. And that's where we're going to need some creativity from people in the next few years. And actually not just creativity, because it is about critical thinking creativity, but it is about making some bold choices. I think it really is about citizens and organizations really making the bold choice to say, we need to build towards sustainability. We need to stop funding on sustainability. We need to stop subsidizing on sustainability. We need to accept the vision of the good life is one that doesn't mean large numbers of devices, whether they're whether they're powered by fossil fuels or even huge amounts of electricity until we develop fusion energy and unlimited energy in that way. What is the good vision of life that comes up with a food system and diets that are sustainable on the planet, and take everything into account? What is the vision of life where you still have a harmony of urban and non-urban environments? That's what it comes down to.
So how, I guess this is kind of how I want to tie things off. I want to leave on a constructively positive, perhaps, note. How optimistic are you about this transformation based on what you're seeing right now? You're seeing some interesting moves by the private sector. You're seeing the recognition of the holes, if you will, that existed in the Aichi, the 2020 framework, and you're seeing, civil society is seemingly becoming more engaged, certainly on the climate front. So, how optimistic are you about society moving in that direction? And then also, in addition to that, what role do you see communication playing in that process? Because I think the UNCBD, and not to put the health of the planet on your shoulders, my friend, but what is the role of, because people need to know here, like this conversation you and I are having is limited to a group of people, and maybe some others.
6 people. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I will be seen on YouTube and so forth, but what's the role of communication in this, and how optimistic are you about this kind of shift that needs to happen?
Well, in terms of communication, I mean, I think something that's really important for the biodiversity field is that them having to come to the terms that the community of people who are at this core, the biophilic people who just love nature and all the life on our planet, it's a small core group. And that if you're going to make that circle bigger, you've got to reach out and understand what motivates other people, and there's a lot of different ways. I mean, some people talk about getting people to fall in love with nature. We talked about it. Some other perspective is like, how do you get people to understand that the living biosphere provides the things that make your life comfortable and possible, that sort of thing. So you've got to come up with stories that talk about the importance of this as the basis for the good life, for survival, and a lot of different versions. Understand that a lot of different reasons for it as well.
Right.
We've gotten farther in that. For a number of years, biodiversity was really this very specific thing, right? If you didn't love hiking, if you didn't love, maybe hunting or whatever, you weren't a fisher folk, you didn't care about it. And so it's gotten large. What's been encouraging is seeing that people are realizing that where they eat, the clothes they wear, that's getting bigger. I mean, the Economist Intelligence Unit put out something last week where they did a survey and discovered that, there is this growth in people being interested in biodiversity, and the fact that what they purchase need to have it. So you take a look at it. They talk about eco-awakening. If you take a look at that EIU report, it shows a growth in there. So that's good.
Yeah.
So that communication is important. But there's got to be a bit of the bias we always balance is saying, our house is on fire, we're in real trouble, versus giving people a bias for hope.
Right.
Because one of the worst things, it seems to me as a communicator, is just to tell people how bad things are, because then the idea is like, well, I'm going to go buy that Escalade, I'm going to roll my windows up and crank the air conditioning up really, really high, because it doesn't matter, I'm going to build my bunker. The other part is to talk about how actions make a difference. And this is where my bias for optimism is that, even if at the top level, there's some really large geopolitical issues that are going to make things tricky, it's interesting to see the private sector engaging and knowing that it needs to make a difference.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see how we've got small people who are creating businesses, companies, organizations that are using technology, artificial intelligence, new knowledge about ecosystems and plants, to come up with new solutions, ways of being more sustainable. Even here in Quebec, I'm just looking at some really great ways that people are starting to reimagine, getting services from ecosystems in a sustainable way. And so those ideas need to be communicated, and not just in a kind of I saw this on the CBC the other day sort of way. They need to be communicated in the sense that, how do you build those communities? So just in the same way that we see, the AI development field here in Montreal, that ecosystem of companies, how do you build that ecosystem of companies working together and building a broader network, so that they're doing it? Look at how small companies in the Basque region have been able to create a strong, thriving network there as well. How does that network work as well? So that's the kind of thing that gives me hope, is that those things can come together, because if you put all of your eggs in the basket and say, right, we're going to hope that the governments of the world come up with this grand agreement, it's going to be strong and successful. Don't put all your eggs in that whole basket. At the same time, you've got to make sure that within that framework, there are things that are pushing and developing and going further.
Right. So a mix of, I won't say top down, but macro frameworks and bottom up activity.
Yeah.
Hopefully meeting in the ground somewhere is where that kind of sweet spot is.
Because for all of these big global institutions, the other thing that we're working with is that we're in an age where, whether it's, inequality of wealth or inequality of access to information, some of these big institutions run the risk of becoming demoored from the other parts. But a real fertility, a real creativity and generation of energy amongst small, medium-sized enterprises can become the basis to reconnect them, right? Because those small, medium-sized enterprises produce ideas that go further up, etc. So, maybe I'm becoming a little bit of a cooperative here, saying like, it's within the framework of these broad global agreements we're going to come up to. How are local communities going to be working? How are they going to be, generating the knowledge that will pop up and be noticed?
Well, I mean, I think you're onto something, frankly, and I think you're not alone, because even like Nina's on this, and Nina and Emily from Whale Seeker, they've been spearheading something called Nets for Net Zero, which is, again, it's an organization that's looking to develop a standard that can kind of put the benchmark for cleaning up the oceans and generating some products that are useful to society, like a full life cycle assessment type of approach, but bringing it legitimacy, putting a standard behind, like an FFC certified, but a Net for Net Zero certified product, for instance. I mean, that just came up from, talking between different groups who are doing different things, who have shared values and shared objectives. So I think that's
really great, because that kind of certification, a lot of people are looking at it, because remember, your average consumer doesn't have a lot of time for information, right? They've got to get something. They need the label, they need the stamp, they need to know, and need to have faith in it. So
you have a QR code back, and you can get the story of where that came from. So I'm going to open it up now. We've been going. I knew we'd go for a while because we like to riff back and forth. There's no beer involved either. We're just.
I was gonna say I was a little bit controlled. I was going like, well, I don't have a beer with me now, so.
Well, I got a beer and a dinner coming your way. So.
Okay.
Folks, any questions? We've got a highly learned and informed individual right here to give us some answers to your questions. And we just gone through like the macro framework of what's going on with the global biosphere. I hope that one of you have some questions for us. Shoot.
Questions, comments as well. People want to weigh into me and say like, oh, that's great, or say, that is absolutely wrong, David. I can't believe you said that.
Yeah, what are you talking about?
Because I say when Dave and I talk, that happens all the time. It's like, what?
Once in a while. Folks, what do you think? Are we onto something or are we not? Seeing silence. I'm going to ask someone then. Oh, here we go. We've got some. Love the transformative definition, the transformation definition. Good. It's always very refreshing to see optimism in this field. Carol, do you have any comments from the African standpoint? Are we, I hope you can hear me. We can even give you the parole if you want, just to update us. You're always doing interesting stuff. I like the idea of private initiative framing us and nature, how governments could help and support. Okay, here's a question, Mirel.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. Yeah, because governments can set up the policy frameworks, and they can set up, some pretty perverse incentives. In fact, a big part of the analysis that I've seen is that, a lot of unsustainable behaviors are the product of policy frameworks, subsidy frameworks that set signals that say like, you might as well be unsustainable as well. So, I think, governments probably need to make sure that they engage into a dialogue with industry on this one as well. So making sure that when they're designing, policy frameworks, looking at getting these ideas, they've brought private sector on board, because it's actually very, very, easy for governments to just sort of, assume that they've got a policy framework, and without testing it, they can have real challenges. So again, in some cases, it's going to require different levels. So, local governments can work with local entrepreneurs, business development banks. The principle that around the world, and some governments have got the principles to help do business development. How can they do so in a nice collaborative process?
Well, ESG is gaining a much more wider audience now. I don't know if you're getting this at the CBD, but certainly on the climate front, in the climate change community, environmental and social governance indicators and so forth. This has become the new CSR, like it's ESG, ESG, ESG. I've been on these Innovate for Climate. That group is doing their a conference all this week. So ESG is all over the place. The Canadian government did a webinar today for the Canadian Embassy on climate finance, ESG. So, I mean, it's there, like there's that's happening, that discourse.
But it's got to move faster. I mean, this is why I see the work that we're doing with the finance sector. So this new task force on nature-related financial disclosure is going to get us a long way in terms of creating that kind of awareness of the sort of risks that are there. So that's sort of the negative way. But then the other part too is looking at the positive opportunities for investments as well, and identifying for the different sectors, you know, taking away from just really basic raw materials, but the dependencies that come about, so that you're doing it properly. I mean, you know, for example, I think, you know, what's the thing that's bugging Canadians right now in the pandemic? They can't renovate because a 2x4 costs them $40 now, where it was, you know, $6 a few months ago.
Yeah, it's crazy.
What does that mean in terms of sustainability? You can trace that back, and you can look at, you know, all the way from management of the forests to sawmill production to constructions as well. So that's an opportunity to look at retooling that industry in a way that's going to make it both, you know, in terms of, you know, good costs for Canadians, but also figure out the sustainability questions.
So you say that some private sector organizations are really leading the charge in terms of engaging. What are the sectors? Like, you don't have to name companies, but where are you seeing the most movement? I know the aggregate sector, like Holcim, cement, and so forth, has been quite active in the past. Same with forestry. What are the ones you're seeing right now that are really
I mean, the aggregate people, it was really interesting. I remember starting to see that move years ago, and I thought that was really excellent. I mean, you know, if we can get them overall, because, you know, their climate impact is huge, but they also, you know, land management is really massive as well. So that's, you know, that's one thing we're seeing the engagement. What we're actually hoping is with them, we can get into the infrastructure field as well. But we're seeing certainly, you know, the big things, mining companies, you know, we've got some of that's coming on as well. And then, I mean, Unilever is really interesting in that respect, because Unilever, for all of the warts that we see, has really been making a concerted effort to look at its way that it engages and deals with biodiversity and a lot of different areas, parts of its agricultural production. So I think a lot of those people who are doing in food production, agriculture production, it's really starting to work out. And that's really important. And that's because that actually is like the entire vertical, right? So it's like, right, so dealing with suppliers, right, from basic ingredients all the way down through to the consumer experience in the stores. And that's a really, really big deal that we're looking at. But most of it's happening in Europe. I've got to be honest. Like, when I look at the people who did Business for Nature, it's big initiatives out of Europe, really. Like, I think, to be honest, here in North America, we've got a lot of ways to go.
Yeah, we've got a lot of catch up to do. I mean, it's a new conversation for most folks that I know in North America. Whereas if you go to any of the international conferences, you bump into, like, you know, it's just like, it's an update when you go to, like I was saying, the first time I encountered it was the Germans, right?
Yeah, the French are leading on this a lot. I mean, the Business for Nature initiative, which has got a lot of companies, it's led out of France. So,
and Brazil's always been quite progressive on this front as well, to give them credit. Brazil?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's critiques of Brazilian policy right now in terms of, but there was a period of time where, Brazil was making great advances on access and benefit sharing. You know, some of the other industries that we're dealing with, you know, dealing with botanicals and that sort of thing. Really, 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 really great stuff. Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Well, sir, we're just moving past 7 here, so we've been on for an hour. I want to thank you very much for taking your time. I know it's been a long day, and
we're starting up again tomorrow. I mean, 7 a.m. we start the thing again. There's some of the contact groups that'll be running late at night too. So
how and I mean, this is the whole experience of doing this through Zoom must be just something else, right? Like, if you call these parallel meetings going on, jumping forth. I mean, I'm trying to do 2 conferences at the same time.
Yeah, it's a real challenge, because, I mean, I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity, but typically when we do these meetings, you know, we've got these big halls, people gather, they lock themselves in a conference room, and they're physically together, you know, between 50 to 60 people, and they're hammering out the discussions, right? So they're in the room talking, and then they break, and then they have coffee or drinks somewhere else. So now when they do that, they're all in little Zoom rooms. So they're like all of us in our own little room, taking care of this, and they've got their phones, so they've got, you know, their device that they're working on, probably 2 devices working on it. So it's a new dynamic. We'll have to see how it goes, because it takes out some of the human contact, because when you do these negotiations, that ability to sort of, you know, slap someone on the back or look them in the eyes, you know, right, physically, we don't have that now. So We'll see. And it's also exhausting because,
Yeah.
you know, you can only do so many hours of Zoom at a time before you.
Yeah. So we're gonna see how this plays out with the COP, because the UNFCCC COP in Glasgow, presumably, will it be the first COP of the Rio Conventions? Like they're trying to do that in person, as I understand, right?
Well, see, that's the interesting thing, because for us, you know, we're finding out that it's probably going to be some form of a hybrid meeting. Now, what that means is a whole other story. You know, how many physical people will be there, how many hours? Yeah, the presidency of COP26 says they want to do it physically.
Yep.
I think on one hand that's very ambitious, and I salute their ambition.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality of the situation sanitaire, you know, the health situation, is that we're not going to have enough people in the world vaccinated by that time to have an, you know, equal participation in that regard. So
equal participation is going to be a big equity issue.
That's what it's always about all the time with these meetings is, you know, does every country have enough resources there to make it happen?
Yeah.
And you know, that's a lot of resentment's generous not there. So we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see how it goes.
Anyway, so we got one comment here. Really appreciating the insight. I live in a municipality that's currently working on a biodiversity conservation strategy as part of the new environmental policy framework. So local work is happening slowly but surely. Thanks for the great work you're doing at the international level. So there we go. Municipal work, moving ahead. That's an example of the agency that you're talking about. This kind of like, you know, not always the most resource situations, but this work is moving forward at the community level, in municipalities, province in some case.
Yeah. I mean, it's the other thing, Caitlin, that's really positive about all that too is, you know, for so long, people associated biodiversity work saying like, right, so we are saving the rhinos here, or we're saving the pandas here, where in fact, it's got to be about what are you doing to manage the life that's around you. And so that kind of stuff allows you to you know, to create the kind of communities, the spaces you live, the gardens, the overall atmosphere that uses life to make your life better, you know, whether it's watershed management, you know, water management, local food, that kind of thing as well. So that's great. Good stuff. Good to see that, Caitlin. Nice.
Good. All right, sir. So, well, thank you very much again. We're going to have to think about what kind of biodiversity we're going to consume when we meet for dinner in Montreal. And by that time, I presume.
Yes, exactly. So, you know, Montreal will start opening.
It's going to be open next week.
The terraces will be opening this Friday. So you show up, and when you're ready to come here, we'll
ready to rock.
Nice, good local foods. Good local foods.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it. All right. David, thanks again. Really appreciate it. Everybody who's coming out, thank you for taking the time to listen to what we have to say. Hopefully you learned something and take forward what you have learned here and perhaps try and be part of that transformational change. If you have any questions for David, feel free to email them to me and then we can try and get them answered for you.
Sure.
All right.
Thanks very much, Dave.
Right.
Thanks, everybody. Good night. Be safe, all. Okay.
Take it easy.
Bye now.